And these are certainly not an exhaustive list of things that you could do either, right? There's a lot of other things that I'm looking forward to the communication, right, with you guys to figure out what other things you have, what other ideas you have out there, or questions or issues you might have that we can try and solve for each other as we work through these different topics. So like Andy said, we're gonna talk about this particular topic in 3 different sections. And so that's going to go through basically the, let me see if I can get these to, there we go. So I'm going to start out with the planning phase, and these are all going to mesh into each other. We can certainly talk about many of these topics at all of these different stages, but I'll break this down as first, what are some things you can do as you're planning a particular activity or trip? What can you do during the trip, or things you might keep in mind while it's actually occurring? And then a quick debrief on what could you do post-trip once you get back from that particular space. And these can be all sorts of different activities that we're participating in. It can be something like a single lesson that you might be taking a class out into, or it can be all the way to a field school that's multiple weeks long. And so some of these might make more sense for some of those versus others of those, but I do want to kind of give you a larger idea of the many things you can do as you're working through taking students out in the field. And so when I think about this, I'll preface this by saying I take students out to El Salvador for a week or 2. And so a lot of times when I'm thinking about inclusive experiences, it's that I have in mind as we're going through. And so I might provide some examples of that. So let's start with before the trip. What are some things you can keep in mind prior to actually leaving, with the idea in mind that you already have your students selected, right? Either they're self-selected in your courses, or they've been selected for an REU, for example, or some other field experience. What can you now do, or what things can you put in place to make sure you provide an inclusive experience for those students? One of the first things you might consider is a code of conduct. And so this can take a variety of different forms, and there are a lot of different examples out there. Like I mentioned, there's REUs that have examples of code of conducts that you can use. But in general, you want to keep in mind some things like, what sort of expectations do students have when they're conducting that work, right, or participating in that activity? It's a good idea to develop these in collaboration with students. This might be harder the first time you do it because you do start with a blank slate or a blank document, but you can build that with the students so that you all come to this understanding about that particular activity that you're working on. And then in subsequent years, you can edit the document that you established ahead of time. And so that can be useful to have post that time frame. And this establishes shared values, and so the students, in essence, build those shared values, right, and then therefore have some buy-in into those values, and so it can be useful in that sense. I have one a resource here, but of course there's a lot of different examples out there. The Identity Safe Classroom by the College Transition Collaborative has some examples. These are going to be classroom specific, so they may not directly translate into the field, but they do give some things to think about. Because you might want to include things like using non-gendered and inclusive language in that student code of conduct, communicating with open, inclusive, multicultural focus in that language. You can have group guidelines for respect and accountability so that students know that, it's my job to be respectful in the field, but it's also my job to make sure other people are respecting other people there in that space. Recognize the positive contributions of all the students that are involved, and then of course showcase students' strengths and the fact that divergent and inclusive perspectives are welcome in that activity. I also recommend that you devise some sort of system to obtain student preferences for some of the experiences that they might be having. You can do a Google form or a Qualtrics form before you leave that asks them questions specific to the activities that you're going to be conducting. So if you're going to have students stay in dorms or are together overnight, you might ask them things like, what sort of roommate preferences or sleeping arrangement preferences do you have, right? Do you feel more or less comfortable rooming with certain genders? You can even ask them things like, if they're going to be living in more of a dorm-like situation, like how comfortable are you with, dirty dishes staying in the sink for a while, right? Or are you not comfortable at all with that? How comfortable are you with swimming? I tend to be really careful, right? I want students to be safe, but it not only just gives me an idea of how comfortable they are with swimming, it gives them the space to voice any concerns that they might have with, say, swimming or any other activity, so that they know that, hey, I'm willing to listen if you don't feel comfortable being in the water, right? I have a student that is perfectly fine swimming, but she has a skin condition, and so she doesn't want to be in the water. And so that, me asking her gives her the space to be able to voice that. This is can be done anonymously, but I always give the students space to say, if you don't feel comfortable filling out a Google form or a Qualtrics, you can always come and talk to me, because they just may not want to put certain things in writing. And that's also, it can be a university concern. So maybe your university doesn't want you using Google Forms because that's not their method. Maybe they want Qualtrics, or they want something else that's more secure. So you might want to keep that in mind. And then you can also ask about comfort with outdoor activities if they're familiar with hiking long distances, or they might not be. And it just kind of gives you an idea of what to expect from the students. And it allows and establishes this, the idea that they are encouraged to advocate for themselves, right? And so you're asking them at all stages, how comfortable do you feel? What can we do going forward, right? And that just establishes an open communication. You always want to keep in mind too, ahead of time, that the point is that they're learning material, not that they're necessarily able to climb a hill, right? Or do some major physical feat, right? So skills over hills. You want to normalize discussion about physical and emotional discomfort. And so they know that they can always come to you if they don't feel up to doing the activity at that particular time. And you should incorporate accessibility early. So include the students in pre-planning, maybe give them a choice about a particular hike, right? So maybe they want to do one particular hike over another, given those constraints, or specializations for each particular person. You can provide options for those hikes, but also give them options for how to do research on the hikes. And so the All Trails app, even in the free version, will tell you the elevation changes on a particular hike. So you can provide that ahead of time, so they have a little bit more information about the location they're going to, or you can give them a Google Earth fly through of a location that you're going to visit. So they just know a little bit more than just showing up the day of, and so they can be a little bit more comfortable. Stokes et al. Has a really good article that I have cited here at the bottom, and I can provide these slides if you're interested later. And they go through a variety of different themes. And so I'll talk about 4 of the major themes that they focus on in terms of accessibility in the field for students. The first one is to emphasize multi-sensory experiences for students. And so thinking about keeping a field guide in both the text format and in an audio format, so that students are able to consume that information in a variety of different forms. You might consider tactile maps of an area, so that students get that sensory experience of either before, right? Or if they aren't able to in person, they can do that while they're in the field, use the tactile maps to explore the area. But you can also do other things like note changes in temperature as you're going along on a hike, right? Or note the changes in humidity. And so you can just make notes of those things so that all students feel like they're experiencing a different environment whenever they're participating. They can feel geologic features, right? So you can encourage those types of interactions. But you also want to keep in mind that some students do get overstimulated, and so you might want to apply some of these senses in isolation if that's the case. Or if you're going to be in a very noisy location, you might consider encouraging a student to bring noise canceling headphones, or providing some for them if that's the case. So that quiz, or that that Google form will help you identify any areas or things you can do like that. You also want to keep in mind multiple means of access to different sites. So it's not necessary that every student go to every particular location that you have set out. Students can view different parts of a site, right? They may get different vantage points from students, and that can be really great. You can encourage students to reconvene at the end of the day or in the middle of the day and talk to each other about the different observations they made at each of the sites. And this can help too if you don't have enough time for everyone to visit every site. You can split groups up and they can experience different sites and then come back and report, right? Compare and contrast. Try to find themes that they experience together. And then you get them talking about that, right? And that's the best way that they can learn. The next theme that Stokes et al. Goes through is the time and to consider the time and pace of your activity. Think about doing an inquiry-based activity so that students can explore on their own and they don't feel rushed to complete a task that they might not have enough time for. And so if you do feel like you want to split them up into groups, perhaps do an inquiry-based thing and then they can come back with each other, and you can intermingle that with other types of activities where they may actually have, something to measure, for example. Make sure you give them plenty of time to complete the task, of course, right? We all know that these things take longer than you think they might. And don't require students to observe a phenomenon while you're also giving them instruction on what it is that they should do, because that can be really overwhelming if they're in a new location and they're trying to, draw or something like that, and you're also talking to them about the particular phenomenon. And you can also consider learning communities. You can, depending on how many faculty members or leaders you have on the trip, you can pair students with them or pair groups of students with them to establish these learning communities where they'll share learning tasks, right? Share goals and experience. So again, that if they're not all able to experience everything, they can come back together and talk to each other about what their different experiences were. And then we want to also think about the resources that students need in order to participate in these different events. You want to be flexible in terms of family and work responsibilities. Students differ with what those might be. So allow for space to voice these concerns. And so it may not be feasible that you expect a student to leave for a full day or multiple days because they have these sorts of responsibilities. And so allowing for, half days or shorter time periods, it will be useful and it can help students that might have those limitations. Normalize information about field prep, right? And normalize not knowing or not owning all that field equipment. And so they may not know what to bring, right? They may not own a pair of waders or something like that. And you can say, right, it's okay if you don't own these things. I didn't own them when I was young, right? And you can provide some anecdotal evidence if you have that. But you can just normalize that so that they know that, hey, not everyone's going to know everything going into this. We're all learning here, and here are some things that might help you when you're out in the field. And this gives the students an opportunity to ask questions about what it is that they should bring. And you can always share resources like outdoor centers if you have a location that can rent this type of equipment. I've also heard about departments establishing lending libraries of sorts for this type of equipment. And so if you have students that are graduating, or if you have an old pair of waders that still work, but you got some new ones, you can put them in the lending library, and then a student that needs them can go and borrow them, right? Or if it's field pants or field shirts, right? Or any type of equipment like that, shoes, right? Boots. It's nice to have that available, and then people can go check that out or check it in as needed. So a few more tips and tricks here. Emphasize open communication about sensitive topics, right? Just from the beginning, just start with, hey, it's okay if you need to go to the restroom, right? Or anything like that, you need something, please let me know. You'll also want to consider the local politics of whatever place it is that you're visiting, if it's not local to you, right? Or an area where the students normally interact with each other. So, right, it might be a country, state, or county that is slightly different than what they're used to. I strongly recommend considering other locations if you can, if there are issues with that, or discuss it with students, right? And tell them why you do want to still visit that particular place, but just be really open with them about what sort of issues they might encounter in that particular location. So you can include specifics in terms of racial or homophobic or other types of violence that might be occurring in that particular area, and just let them know in the planning phase that might come up. Discuss the history of the area, right? You don't want this to go unacknowledged or assume that things are going to be okay. You can talk about these things. And it's really important to let non-minoritized students know that the kinds of issues that minoritized students might face in those areas, so that those students can support students that might be targeted in those spaces. So having the students do like a bystander training, particularly if they're going to be in an area for a long time period, or allyship training. That way, if something happens when you're out in the field, and this has happened to me before, where the other people around me did not know I was being targeted. And so it can be really hard to have to explain that in the moment, right? But if people are aware of that ahead of time and they say, this is weird, that's weird, why did somebody say something weird? They know automatically like, hey, we've already talked about this and this could be that thing. Let me do something to sort of, you know, deflect, right? Or whatever a mechanism they might want to use in that particular time. You'll want to also, right, if you're going to go to one of these places, to notify local entities that people might be, you know, running around wearing some orange vests, you know, and they're going to be conducting measurements. And, you know, in my case, these people are brown and they might not fit in, right, or something. And so, or they have a funny name, right? And so just let them know that, right, and I say that to myself because I've been targeted because of my name. That, you know, these people are going to be present in that space, and that way they're just aware that you're in that, and that something might occur there. And then I'll say here at the beginning too, right, you'll want to develop safety protocols, of course. That's going to differ, right? And again, that can be its own whole topic in and of itself. And it might be useful to also talk to the Title IX office. And I'll talk a little bit more about this in our sort of during phase of the field work. But before you leave, it might be good to either have the Title IX office come talk to the students. This has been particularly useful in places like field schools, where they just, you know, this is who you contact in case anything happens. And it gives the students a face to a name that they can go to if something does happen. And then you also want to try to create a community beforehand. Then this will differ again, depending on whether they've already been in the classroom together or they're all new and they haven't met each other. But you can do different things to create that community. For example, the College Transition Collaborative has a creating social connectedness information and tips. If you aren't familiar too, there's something called Fast Friends, which is a series of questions that you ask each other in different phases as you're getting to know each other. And it just gets people to know a little bit more about your background. And so the questions are phrased in such a way that you learn a lot about people, and it sort of stimulates conversation. And then of course have an orientation, but I encourage you that rather than just talking at the students during your orientation to tell them about what the experience is going to be like, but to also then make sure you provide space for the students to connect with each other if they haven't met each other before. Okay, so now I want to hear from you guys. We're going to move over into our breakout rooms and the Jamboards. I'm curious about what tips and tricks you've used in the planning phase when you're thinking about field inclusion, or any issues that you might have had and ways that you solved them, or perhaps suggest ways for other people to solve them. I'll let Andy take the wheel here and do his magic.
Thank you, Didi.
Oh.
That was awesome. Great start. Looking forward to the Jamboard. Let me share with everybody what we're going to do, and let me.
I'm going to pause the recording. Start the recording. Thank you. Okay, so now we kind of move into the space where, you know, we're on the trip itself. And so what are some things that you can do as you're beginning to actually get there, right, and starting to do the activity itself? And so always stay engaged, actively listen to the students, engage with the quieter ones, preferably one-on-one, at least at first, because they may not want to talk to a group or more than just the one person. Being relatable, I know this can be hard, right? Sometimes if they're not just intentionally always like that, we all have different personalities, but that just helps increase comfort, right? So they know that, you know, you have issues going to the bathroom too, or tell a funny story or something like that, when it was new to you. Like Andy was talking about, right? So we can have like talking circles. I like to do these at the end of each day when we're in El Salvador. And so the students can come together and, talk about anything they'd like to talk about, right? You can encourage them to either anonymously or in person talk about certain things like, we had the students like say something you learned about one of your fellow students, right? That you didn't know before, right? That's cool that you're like, hey, I didn't know we had that in common or something like that, to try to develop that sense of community amongst themselves. You can also create a space for private feedback. And so, for example, in El Salvador, I do written cards that they can put anonymously in cups throughout where we're staying. And then that way I can read them in case I need to be aware of something, or if they want to make the whole group aware of something that's going on. But you can also do, like, if you're in a field school where the students are not necessarily staying with each other, maybe they're going back home. We have a field school here, an archaeology field school, that's the case. A Google form, right, that anybody can fill out at any time, so they can provide anonymous feedback that maybe something happened you weren't aware of, and they want to make you aware of that. So there's multiple ways you can do that. You always want to keep self-care and group care in mind. Proactively plan bathroom breaks while you're out there, and self-care breaks. Might be particularly important for people that are more used to more quiet time, right? Or so introverted, right? They gain their energy by being alone. If you're away with the group all the time, it might be really important that certain students get that alone time so they can recharge. Discuss differences actively throughout the trip or activity, and from a multicultural perspective. Be aware that students might change when they're out there, right? During an activity, they may want to not complete the hike, right? Or they may change their mind about how they feel about being in that particular body of water. And then check in with those struggling students. Try not to draw attention to them. You could potentially pair the students with each other if you find that might be helpful, but you do want to talk to the other student you might pair them with, just to make sure that they're comfortable helping out a student that might be struggling. And they might be struggling, not necessarily physically, but maybe they're just not grasping the content the way that the others are. And so ask another student by themselves, right? Hey, are you willing to help out another person that might need some help, to sort of get that feedback, so you're not burdening another student when they don't want to be. Of course, right, negative things can happen out in the field. If there are incidents that occur, you want to address them early and with the different groups that may have witnessed the incident. So even if it was a smaller group that it happened to, you'll want to address it with the whole group, like, hey guys, this thing happened, that it was probably not okay, right? Depending on what it is. And then also address the students that might have been attacked separately. And so to make sure that they feel comfortable with what's going on, or what the plan is going to be for, moving forward, or to ask them how you can make them feel better moving forward, right? What things can be done to alleviate some of those pressures they might be feeling. And then know how to deal with escalating situations. And again, this could be several talks. We could do a lot of discussing around this. College Transition Collaborative has some tips on how to handle those. And they're going to be very different depending on what happened, right? If it's a sexual harassment issue versus a race issue, right? Or a number of other things, you'll want to address them differently. You'll want to address each group differently at different time periods, right? And that link there, which again, I can provide later, goes through different scenarios and like things you might do or things you might keep in mind if X happens or if Y happens. So kind of provide some useful tips there. Sexual harassment is also an issue, and we want to be inclusive in these spaces in case something might happen, or so students feel comfortable coming forward. The Southeast Archaeological Group, known as the SHARP Committee, that I have a friend on, they do a lot of work on this, and they've done quite a lot of work examining sexual harassment in archaeological field schools and trying to prevent sexual harassment in those spaces. And so there are ways, right, we can try to prevent these or make people feel comfortable to coming forward if they do end up happening. And so just to preface, right, this is including comments directed at someone because of their sex or unwelcome sexual advances or demands. And it can also include gender harassment. I've been present when a colleague said, a man is going to be better at that thing, and even if they're, and that's just not okay, right? If you're any sort of comment where you're saying a man or a woman is going to be better or worse at a particular thing would be considered gender harassment. But it also includes unwanted sexual attention and sexual coercion. But what sort of things can you do? So I recommend that the students are constantly informed, both before the trip, but during the trip too, about the reporting network and any safe individuals that they could potentially go to. And so SEAC has this little matrix that you can fill out ahead of time that has these names, right? It's not an exhaustive list necessarily. It depends on your institution, but have people on there like the Title IX coordinator, right? Mental health services, the dean, the department chair, other departmental allies that either are present at the location or not present, right? That the students might be familiar with. They can contact someone that's, back home if you're in a new location. University police, if it makes sense, if you're on campus, advocacy groups, the local hospital or local police of where you'll be at, right? And there's a lot of people you could also include on this list, but that kind of just gets you started. It shows the students, right, like here are the people to contact. You can even have these people come speak to the students ahead of time, particularly if you're going to be with the students for an extended period of time, right? Or maybe you're doing several lessons in the field through the semester. And so they can come speak to the students so they know where they can go for different issues. Make the reporting mechanisms easy to access, discuss shared values and how you'll hold each other accountable to those. One of the things I think that came up in the discussion too is like, I suggest having a safe word that in case anything happens. And so this might be something as simple as like just an uncomfortable topic comes up, right? And you don't know what that uncomfortable topic is going to be because we're in the field, right? People talk about all sorts of things. That's just, you're spending a lot of time together. Maybe, I experienced a racist issue and I don't want to talk about it, right? I can say the safe word if it starts coming up and people are bugging me about it, right? Or I feel uncomfortable about a particular topic and everybody knows, hey, if the safe word is said, we move on, right? Another topic, we're going to talk about something else. That's not, it's not something that anybody wants to talk about or that person doesn't feel comfortable. Stop inappropriate jokes and conversations, obviously, when you hear them. It's also a good idea in that idea of normalizing, right? Making yourself relatable. Introduce the idea that you have a boss, right? Because that allows them the space to know that if you do something wrong, they have somewhere to go to, right? And so you just want to make sure that everybody knows that, hey, I'm not, I could potentially do something bad. Like, here's who you would go to if you don't feel comfortable coming to me, or if you feel like I've done something. And I think that makes you relatable too. And then have these listed individuals potentially talk to the students if it makes sense, like I said before. Okay, so that was quick. I want some more ideas from you guys about what other tips and tricks you've used while you're actually out in the field, or any issues that you've had in those times.
Excellent. Thank you, Didi. All right, so we a couple folks dropped. So I think what we'll do is maybe we'll go to 4 rooms, and we'll randomize it again in the chat room. Oh, here we go.
Okay, thank you. So I just have one really quick slide on when you get back, and then we can open up to the discussion. So some things to think about when you wrap up your trip. So checking in with your students, right? Another good chance to have an anonymous response mechanism like a Google form or something where you ask them questions about how things might have gone. Ask them advice on what they give to students that are doing the activity next time, right? What sort of advice would they provide, either about equipment or what the experience is like, right? What's the one thing you would tell students, or would you tell students to do this and why or why not, or something like that. Of course, right, we're all really busy. When you get back from the field, you're like, okay, next thing, what's going on, right? But it's a really good chance. I encourage you to revisit your policies, your documents, right? You just like you're going to update your lessons, update any issues you might have had, right? Think about what you should have done differently, or think about like, wow, we could have really used the contact number for this person because, I didn't think this was going to happen, but let me add that to my matrix, of people to contact or something like that. So I encourage you to revisit those and update them. And then of course, right, document and or report any hostile encounters that you had, right? Make sure that you kind of dotted all your I's, crossed all your T's in terms of who you should talk to if something did happen, right? You want to make sure that you sort of wrap those up as much as you possibly can, write it down if you need to, so that you have a written record, right? In case you forget what might have occurred. So, okay, thank you so much. This was a great talk. I'd really like to open it up now, right? If you have any other methods or experiences, whether it's, you know, at the end of the thing itself, right, the activity itself, or any river specific ones. I know these were kind of more general throughout the talk. So